Hello, everybody out there. Welcome to a new episode of Coffee Ground. Today, again with Jens, like always, but with a very special guest. He is a well known philosopher from Britain coming to us here, and his name is David Pearce. Hello, David.
Hello, Marcus. Hello, Jens. Good to be with you.
You are a very, very interesting man because you are philosophing and working on a very interesting topic called transhumanism. If I'm saying it right, because there are a lot of words that I read on the internet that you are working on that I didn't weren't even able to pronounce. So, the thing is, we will talk about transhumanism today, and David, if you could just introduce yourself. But first, I want to say we're in a little bit of a good cop, bad cop situation here in this way that Jens knows a little bit and I don't know anything. So Jens will ask the interesting questions, and I would just ask the questions like normal, light-minded people like me would ask the questions. So, um, I think this is a good way to do this. I hope you have no problem with this. So, David, would you introduce yourself to the audience?
Yes, hello. I'm a transhumanist. In the year 1995, I wrote an online manifesto with a rather debauched sounding title, The Hedonistic Imperative. And the hedonistic imperative urges us to use biotechnology to phase out pain and suffering throughout the living world and create a new architecture of mind, life based entirely on gradients of intelligent bliss. And in 1997, a young postgrad at LSE called Nick Bostrom stumbled across the manifesto, uh, got in touch, and together in 1998 we set up the World Transhumanist Association, currently rebranded as Humanity Plus. Transhumanism is an immensely diverse movement of ideas. Simplistically, it can be summed up with the idea of creating a triple S civilization of super intelligence, super longevity, and super happiness. Superintelligence itself, many, many different currents. This is the idea that humans are transitional and the future lies in beings that are unimaginably superior intellectually in the richest possible sense of the intellect than existing humans. Super longevity, that's fairly straightforward. This is the idea that just as silicon robots can be upgraded and repaired indefinitely, there's no technical reason in principle why we shouldn't phase out the biology of aging in humans and enjoy indefinite youthful lifespans. The third strand of transhumanism, and this is my primary focus, this is the idea that it'll be possible to replace the ghastly cruelties of Darwinian life with something much, much more civilized, not merely to phase out the biology of suffering, but to radically upgrade our reward circuitry so life can be based ultimately on gradients of superhuman bliss. So there you have it. As a useful mnemonic, the three supers, what is transhumanism? But I've glossed over all manner of subtleties.
Okay. So you are working.
Okay.
So we can say you're working on the next evolution of humankind. Can we say it like this?
Well, yes, humans are going to become transhuman and eventually post-human. It's conventional, though not entirely arbitrary, when humans cease to be human and become something else. But yes, initially we're going to tweak our genetic source code. Eventually, we're going to edit it. And yes, humans are going to become extinct, not in some probably mass extinction event, but because we re-engineer ourselves and the rest of Darwinian life to be something better.
Okay, David. So I have found your person because of your idea of the so-called paradise engineering. It's what you already told. The idea we can end suffering in the world. Your idea is even we can end all suffering in the world for all sentient beings. I was carrying with or for the idea of animal equality, watching some sources in the internet facing this topic, and so I found your person. It's a very interesting idea. You have a website called the Abolitionist Project, what means where you're talking about these ideas. In a short video, you introduced at first we will care for mankind, then for mammals, and then for all sentient beings. You already talked a bit how to do this with gene drives, with nanotechnology. Can you talk a bit more about your idea, how we can achieve this, maybe also in a sociological way?
Yes, I mean, I like to cite the the World Health Organization definition of health. Health is a state of complete physical, emotional, social well-being. Here we have a ridiculous, almost absurdly transhumanist definition of health that is enshrined in the Constitution of the World Health Organization. Uh, and a lot of the work I've done is trying to show how this vision of good health for all sentient beings could actually come to pass. And if I can now, if you like, to sketch out some of the core ideas. It is no sentient being in history has ever been healthy by the World Health Organization definition of health. The only way that one could engineer even an approximation of the WHO definition of health uh, is some form of genome reform. And I argue and tentatively predict that all prospective parents should be given access to pre-implantation genetic screening, counseling, and eventually genome editing, so they can choose, most notably, the approximate pain tolerance, hedonic range, and hedonic set points of their future children. Now, this isn't sci-fi. Something like the SCN9A gene, the so-called volume knob for pain, dozens of different variants, nonsense mutations not merely abolish pain, but also abolish nociception. We're not, and nociception is vital. But there are also low pain variants of SCN9A. And imagine if you could choose essentially what level of pain tolerance, pain sensitivity you want for your future children. You could do the traditional genetic crapshoot, or you could choose one of the benign variants of SCN9A. If you've ever met someone who says something like, oh, pain is just a useful signaling mechanism, people's pain tolerance, pain sensitivity varies immensely. And so that's so-called physical pain. Mental pain is more complex, self-evidently so. But even a couple of tweaks could essentially defang the problem of psychological mental pain. Recall today something like, this is awful, something like 800,000 people each year in the world take their own lives, primarily due to depression. Hundreds of millions of people are clinically or subclinically depressed. Even a few genetic tweaks could ensure that future children have a high hedonic set point, are innately happy. For example, and this is once again, I'm going to focus on specific genes. Jo Cameron, a Scottish woman, was in the news a few years ago. Jo thought she was completely normal. She's a vegan, retired Scottish school teacher. She has an extraordinarily high pain threshold, but not just that, she is never anxious, never depressed. goes through life in a chronic state of mild but intelligent euphoria. She's a vegan. She's incredibly socially responsible. But the reason she goes through life in this state seems to be that she has an unusual dual mutation of the far and far out genes. And these mutations mean that she has unusually high levels of anandamide. From the Sanskrit terms for bliss, anandamide is an endogenous cannabinoid that is found in the CNS. And in principle, it would be possible to ensure everyone has those dual mutation. All manner of pitfalls, which I'm sure we can come to with this kind of scenario. But yeah, just to summarize, it'll be possible for prospective parents to choose the default level of mental and physical pain or well-being of their future children. And eventually, I would anticipate there will be intensifying selection pressure against a lot of our nastier bits of code. It's not just the well-known genetic diseases that are going to disappear, but as more and more parents choose benign alleles and allelic combinations for their children, eventually the nasty stuff is going to disappear into the dustbin of history. As humans, at the moment, tragically, horrifically, billions upon billions of sentient beings as sentient as small children, suffer and die in factory farms and slaughterhouses. And I would argue that the most urgent aspect of the abolitionist project is phasing out animal agriculture. This is most likely to occur not just via moral argument, which is the way it ought to be, but also via cultured meat and farm-free animal products. And I would argue it really is what we're doing. I think future generations will look upon what humans did to non-humans as a crime on a par with the Holocaust. And it's only where Israel, it's been said, is going to be probably the first vegan nation. Many Jewish people have drawn this parallel, so I'm not being in any way insensitive. But beyond humans and domestic non-human animals, there is also the problem of wild animal suffering. To quote Richard Dawkins, the amount of suffering. Oh, yes?
It's the topic of reprogramming predators. Also, yes.
Yes.
Mhm.
Yeah, I
Naively,
also
the
read
problem
this.
of wild animal. Naively, the problem of wild animal suffering is completely intractable. I mean, one feeds a lot of starving herbivores in winter, and this leads to a population explosion of herbivores, followed by starvation, more predators. Yeah, the problem is naively completely intractable, but not so. And it's possible to sketch out a more civilized form of population regulation. It would be possible to use cross-species fertility regulation to manage population sizes. In the long run, we can herbivorize predators, genetically reprogram members of predatory species so they don't harm others. Our successors, I think, will treat as self-evident the idea that sentient beings shouldn't harm each other. And one of the exciting forms of technology that's being explored in the past few years are gene drives, CRISPR-based gene drives, and they're very interesting because they enable intelligent moral agents to do something that naively sounds ecologically illiterate, which is to spread benign genes and allelic combinations across an entire species, even if the mutation in question would normally have a fitness cost to the individual. So in principle, for example, earlier I mentioned SCN9A. If one wanted to spread benign versions of SCN9A gene, the volume knob for pain, across hundreds of thousands of free living animal species, it would be possible to do so with gene drives which cheat the laws of Mendelian inheritance and enable, simply by releasing a few hundred of the members of the species with the benign mutation, all the offspring of of these genetically individuals will carry the benign mutation. Essentially, it can spread across all members of the species, even in extremely inhospitable environments, inhospitable to humans. Essentially, the whole biosphere is going to be programmable. Before doing anything like this, one would, of course, be using pilot studies, self-contained artificial biospheres, stuff like that. A lot of this probably sounds like sci-fi,
Yes.
but yeah. But essentially, every cubic meter of the planet is shortly going to be accessible to surveillance, micromanagement, and control. And one can sketch some very dark Orwellian scenarios. But if we want to have a living world in which all sentient beings can flourish, biotechnology gives us the tools for the job.
I
We're
mean,
not clearly here talking about a 5 year plan or even realistically, sociologically,
why
a
not?
50-year plan.
Why don't you have a 5-year plan? This would be so cool. You can say my 5-year plan to overtake the world. So, but
So,
you said it right. It's often sounds like science fiction. The thing is that um I read a lot about you, and a lot of the things you say sound always remembered things from science fiction movies. Like you once in your Wikipedia it says with maybe brain self stimulation there could be achieved like things like having no depression anymore. There are examples of people that did this, and where it worked out. And this remembers me or reminds me of Blade Runner, where there is a device that gives you the opportunity just to say, okay, I want to feel good today, so I just press a button and I feel good. And this gives so much. I mean, this really turns around everything we know about emotions right now. Like we feel, but do we feel good because we want to feel good? Do we feel bad like we want to feel bad in the future? These are things that we have to ask ourselves.
you do not want to feel bad, so you will always feel good. I had many thoughts, David, and it's a very amazing kind of thinking because it's far away from the topics that we issue also in philosophy and in other
Yes.
topics. So one of my idea was um, I like the idea a lot to end extreme forms of suffering, all kinds of extreme pain for us humans, for non-human animals, either if it's in factory farms or if it's in free nature. I also think that future generations will think about this, what we do today to animals. They will think in the same way about this like we think today about slavery and say, how could people do this? And nevertheless, the idea of ending all kinds of sufferings has given a few, more or less philosophic ideas to me. What is a mild suffering? Because a mild suffering is also maybe there is a meme. I can't hear the TV while I'm eating potato crackers, for example. So there is many kinds of mild suffering, and you also want to end this, if I'm right. But maybe emotional suffering, if it's not that bad, can be an emotion for motivating, for saying to animals and also for human beings to say, I want to change something in my life. But I have read in your blog article, you want to do this with driving high the positive emotions. Can you talk more about this idea? How to, how should you
Yeah.
say, that you keep the motivation of animals, of human beings, to do something in our lives without any kind of bad emotion.
Yes. Marcus talked about intracranial self-stimulation
Yes.
or wireheading. In principle, at any rate, it would be possible to abolish suffering, at least in humans right now, by wiring everyone up to what used to be called the pleasure centers. And this is simplistic. They might be more realistically, in the case of the mesolimbic dopamine system, be called the desire centers. But without going into details there, essentially, wireheading in the broadest sense destroys information sensitivity. It is uniform bliss. Whereas essentially, what I'm arguing both technically and sociologically is what we need to be doing is ratcheting up hedonic range and hedonic set points to preserve information sensitivity. So one preserves motivation, critical insight, social responsibility, capacity for personal growth. And schematically, and I stress the schematically, if Darwinian life, the hedonic range stretches from -10 to 0 to +10, with -10 being abject suicidal depression, despair, 0 being emotionally neutral states, and +10 sublime bliss. Mastery of our reward circuitry will, in principle, allow us to choose a hedonic range, which could be from, let's say, 0 to +10. But there's no reason in the long run why one can't have a civilization of, and this is, as I said, schematic, +70 to +100. And the darkest depths of post-human civilization could surpass today's peak experiences, while, and this, as I said, is absolutely critical, retaining information sensitivity. A notional civilization with a hedonic range of +70 to +100 would in one sense have greater hedonic contrast and then a civilization based on the kind of reward circuitry of Darwinian life. Now, that's a very extreme example. It's my tentative prediction for the future that, life will be based entirely on gradients of superhuman bliss. But in the meantime, I think the morally urgent thing to do is to ratchet up hedonic range and hedonic set point.
But there are also examples for this sort of brain stimulation. How said? I mean, that there people got their how we say depression cured through the stimulation of the brain or through the stimulation of the happy part of the brain. So the question that always gets me in this is because we said it sounds like science fiction, and in every form of science fiction, when one does become a greater person over the other, so people start to get crazy. So what's the top of the tower here? I mean, in every form of science fiction or story I've ever read, anyone started describing himself as a god because he was better than all the other ones. So what's the top of the tower here? Where can we go?
Well, if one were doing a story, there can be a real twist in the plot that no one
Yes.
expects. And the twist in the plot is that nothing actually goes wrong, that we create a world based on gradients of intelligent bliss. And yes, it doesn't lead to some form of terrible consequence in future, but just as we now take for granted pain-free surgery, our successors will take for granted pain-free life. In practice, getting there is going to be strewn with all manner of pitfalls. Is it possible that the future does lie in some form of wireheading? Probably unlikely, because one thing about notional wireheads is that they don't want to create baby wireheads. There will be selection pressure against any predisposition to spend one's life hooked up to a pure pleasure machine. But if we are prepared to ratchet up hedonic set points and hedonic range, then it's possible for you to preserve your existing values and preferences, and personal relationships. But yeah, I essentially imagine waking up tomorrow in an extremely good mood, but with your core values, preferences, relationships intact. And yeah, I'm not trying to sell you my vision of paradise. I could outline to you my vision of a perfect world, perfect bliss. You don't need to buy into that at all. Ratcheting up hedonic set points, is neutral in that respect. And sorry, I'm using a bit of jargon here. Perhaps just in case any of your listeners haven't stumbled across the idea, this is essentially the notion of the hedonic treadmill that most of it, essentially all of us really, have this approximate hedonic set point around which we tend to fluctuate in the course of a lifetime. There's a so-called lottery paradox. 6 months after either winning the lottery or having a terrible accident that leaves you quadriplegic, most people 6 months later will have reverted to their approximate level of well-being or ill-being before the win or the accident. And no amount of social engineering, socio-political reform is by itself going to shift the your approximate hedonic set points. There's no evidence that on average today humans are subjectively better off than their ancestors on the African savannah. And if we want to create a happy world, a blissful world, the only way to do so is to ratchet up hedonic set points. This could, in principle, be done with designer drugs, but any form of euphoriant designer drug is likely to have horrendous pitfalls, possibility of abuse.
No.
By contrast, if we are willing to use genetic interventions, germline engineering, and optionally too, of somatic gene therapy for existing humans, non-human animals, it will be possible to ratchet up hedonic set points so that the hedonic treadmill, in some sense, will still operate. There'll be still bad hair days, even in transhuman, posthuman paradise. But yeah, default levels of being will be immeasurably richer than today.
Mhm. So,
Okay.
so the thing is to do.
Just very short, Marcus, and I give to you. Thank you, David. You have seen I was just switching my device because now I'm logged in with another phone where I have better signal and better camera signal from you. So nice to be here again. When you're talking about designer drugs, many people will now immediately think on Brave New World. So David, you already wrote a blog article about the idea why your idea of paradise engineering is much better than the dystopy of Brave New World. And you have explained in very good arguments why you see it like this. Maybe you can briefly make clear these differences. Before this, I want to let Marcus give his question.
It's all good. I just wanted to wrap up what you just said, David. It sounds to me like doing stuff, but not doing too much to not change what humans are or human beings will be. So doing something like wiring people or yeah, better the situation, but not too much so we don't lose ourselves as humans. Do I sum it up right, or is it?
Yes, I mean, I confess there is the element of, how should I put it, persuasion propaganda here, in that, yes, even in practice, values, the whole texture of existence will be radically transformed in a world without suffering based on gradients of bliss. But if you're hedonic set point were ratcheted up, you wake up in the morning, you would still support your existing football team. No one with a few complications need worry that they will be sacrificing their core values on the altar of someone else's conception of paradise. It's more a case of thinking what your conception of the good life paradise is and enabling you to appreciate it more richly.
Okay. So, can you repeat your question again, Jens?
Yeah, my question before was just for causing the idea of a brave new world and why it's not like this. Another thought that I had, all the ideas we're talking about have a wide philosophical and even religious dimension, because it's about the idea we could like play God, we could create world new. This is why on the one hand, many Christian people say this idea it's bad. We cannot change nature. We are not allowed to change. Also here, you're on your blog already talking about things like anesthetica. When anesthetica have been invented, there were also priests who said, no, it's good to feel the pain during an operation, what is completely cruel. No non-human being, also not a very religious people, would say, oh, I want to get my knee operation without anesthetica because it's the will of God. So this is completely crazy in my eyes. Me personally, I would even say your idea is a very Christian idea, because it's the idea to be compassion towards all sentient beings. How would you say this? Are you also arguing your ideas with religious people?
Yes, for a religious audience, let's consider a Christian audience. I would probably focus on the Book of Isaiah. Recall the Book of Isaiah prophesies a world in which the lion and the wolf lie down with the lamb, a happy, peaceful, blissful biosphere. And if you're a biblical literalist, I don't know how many millions of biblical literalists there are in the world, this is going to come to pass. And what I've been doing essentially is setting out some of the technical details that the Bible is rather light on. In terms of spirituality, it will be possible to use biotechnology to engineer states of super spirituality too. Take someone having the most intense spiritual experience, identify the molecular signatures of spirituality, and then massively enrich, amplify them. There's no such thing simplistically as the God gene one sometimes reads in the literature, but it would be possible to engineer beings who are super spiritual. Now, this is not what I argue for, but it's one of the technical options that will be feasible in future. And if you're religious, some people just have naturally no religious or spiritual sense. But if you want the kind of well-being that is intensely spiritual, then biotech gives you the tools for the job. Switching tack slightly before I lose your point. What do people say at this kind of scenario? Two responses. One is, oh, but that's eugenics. The other, but that's just Brave New World. And clearly there are affinities with Brave New World. But recall in Brave New World, Soma, this so-called ideal pleasure drug, was used by the ruling elites to essentially keep the deltas and the epsilons in place. It was a pleasure drug used as a tool for social manipulation. Huxley, in one sense, he gets things wrong insofar as in reality it is depression, low mood that is associated with subordinate behavior, keeping one's head down, that other things being equal, ratcheting up people's hedonic range, hedonic set points, is more likely to lead to a world of active citizens. Um, there is not yet a drug like Soma. In principle, there might be designer drugs, but it would be so much better, I argue, if gradients of well-being were the default, rather than trying to fix existing problems. Far better to have innately happy, healthy babies.
Mm.
Yeah, thanks a lot
Thank you.
for explaining all this. Um, one critical question. Um, when we come away from the idea of super happiness and we talk about the other triple S things, so like super intelligence, I still fear it's the way of trying to bring human beings away from this, what we call a human being. As I see it, a very demanding task to end suffering, to end hardcore suffering in nature, for all beings. I'm not so convinced about the idea of super intelligence and if it is a good idea. I've also read on your very interesting Facebook page a guy talking about the idea to upgrade animals in the meaning of become, for example, a rabbit intelligent like a human being, and that we can talk with the rabbit, and then the rabbit can think like we do. This is very far away from our nature. Do you think there is also a possibility to for a world that respects your ideas in kind of super happiness, but maybe we stay our normal that we keep our normal biologic device called like this when it comes to intelligence. The rabbit is allowed to stay a rabbit. A human being is allowed to stay a human being with our kind of cognition that we have it now.
Yeah, and I don't see any moral urgency in intellectually
Mm-hmm.
upgrading a rabbit. Uh, I do think we have an obligation to make sure rabbits don't suffer. In the
Yes.
wild, rabbits suffer a great deal. Most come to a nasty end at an early age. Much of their lives are marked by fear and hunger. But if one has happy bouncing bunnies that are not vulnerable, one would use various forms, whether one could use immunocontraception or tunable synthetic gene drives. One can control population numbers, protect the bunnies from predation. I don't see any moral urgency in upgrading the bunny, and it becomes a largely linguistic matter. And it would be as a I mean, there are various ways where one could cognitively upgrade bunny rabbits, but I wouldn't say it's morally urgent in the same way as fixing the problem of suffering is. I mean, another complication is, and I could set out my scenarios for the ideal society. One has got to think not just what is technically feasible, but what is sociologically, politically credible, not just now, 50, 150 years. An example here would be predation. I personally would not be unhappy if members of predatory species were simply peacefully retired. Use of sterilization, essentially, so that obligate predators simply went extinct and we controlled population of herbivores via immunocontraception, gene drives, and so forth. But most people are aghast at this suggestion. Uh, they want to see charismatic uh, megafauna, like members of the cat family, for example, they want them conserved. And so one has to make compromises. And one of these compromises will be herbivorizing members of the cat family, for example.
Okay.
Okay. Marcus, do you have some questions? I would have
Um,
some, but it's on you
um,
now.
I mean, okay. So, so the thing that I'm reading out of this is that you work in a very interesting field, like putting it all together, ending the suffering in the world, and bringing the humanity to a new step. Sounds like a good thing, or is a good thing. The problem is that a lot of people in the last 100 years had ideas for sci-fi stories that catch or go in this direction, and in their mind it always had a negative outcome, that humans lose their humankind, humanship, that humans lose the way, that the ways of rules we have for society maybe start to crumble, because or that rich and powerful ones up there try to use it for their own, yeah, for their own ways to legitimate their power. So the thing is, what are the dangers you see, and is there, or better said, is there any kind of genuine hate you receive for this? I mean, are there trolls or people that tell you that this you do is devil's work? I said before we started the call, I talked to a colleague about this topic yesterday, and he said it's straight up devil shit. So, how do you cope with this? Or is there genuine critiques you get, and yeah, how is this?
And people who get in touch are almost by definition unrepresentative. And this unrepresentative minority of people who get in contact after they stumble across this work, it's a mixture of the enthusiasts and the haters. And it's not often I'm accused of hobnobbing with the devil, but as you can probably guess, people say, "Well, this is this is 20th century stuff, eugenics." But a commitment to the well-being of all sentients was not one of the tenets of National Socialism, and though casually in conversation and debate, the term Hitler and Nazism and all the rest of it has been thrown about. This is fanciful, really. It really is. I mean, there is the problem with the E word. Are we actually arguing a transhumanists, people who support the abolitionist project? Do we support eugenics? And the option here is either to go for so-called linguistic reclamation in the same way that derogatory terms for black people, gay people, some of them attempts have been made to rehabilitate the terms. Is this possible with the E word? I don't know. Or alternatively, one can speak of genome reform. Now, most people, including people who are ferociously opposed to eugenics, actually accept the idea that in the case of well-known genetic diseases, something like cystic fibrosis, for example, that it is appropriate to screen and remove the cystic fibrosis, well, actually, I don't know, 1,000+ different alleles, but essentially to phase out cystic fibrosis, whereas most people are against the notion of genetic enhancement. But by the criteria of anything like the World Health Organization definition of health, all the interventions I've been discussing are forms of remediation. I think, like, yeah, with hundreds of millions of people worldwide victims of depression, depressive disorder, other forms of mental illness, hundreds of millions of people with pain disorders, we're really talking about remediation. And depression cripples, destroys people's quality of life at least as
Yeah,
much as the well-known physical genetic disorders.
yeah, it does, and it's too less talked about. Yeah.
Yes. Um, what comes to my mind? Me, I am a sociologist, and I'm common, and I like a lot the idea of psychohistory. Maybe you have heard about it, David. I don't know.
Psychohistory. Would you say?
Psychohistory. Yes. So briefly said, psychohistory, it's a kind of psychological science that says that all adults in our societies have been children, and the society of millions of adults, it's always the follow of how have these people been treated as children. Lloyd de Maus is a famous name in Germany. It was the sociologist Erich Fromm, or nowadays Sven Fuchs, who are talking about this topic. And they say because there is a lot of violence against children in history, it has been horrible. Still today, unfortunately, there is still existing the idea that education means beating his children, and that means that many people, many adults had a horrible childhood. And the idea is that the most of our violence that we see in the world, also even how wars um, can start, has to do a lot with the inner soul of the people that is full of hatred that comes from traumatized experiences during childhood. Um, I think if we talk about the idea of changing the gene drive of human beings, we should also talk about how can we, with our nowadays biology, just become better humans with treating ourselves better, with stopping violence. Um, do you see that we can bring these two topics together? Or you say, no, if we do transhumanism, all other issues will be solved automatically?
First, a narrow technical point, then to answer your question. Gene drives essentially would be used for free living non-human animals in nature. In the case of humans, we reproduce so slowly for them to be relevant gene drives that cheat the laws of Mendelian inheritance. Um, but back to your point, as well as ratcheting up hedonic range and hedonic set points, should one be making other forms of intervention too? And for evolutionary reasons, it's very crude and simplistic to say that evolution designed male humans to be hunters and warriors, but it's revealing that even children who've come from very sheltered, compassionate homes, and I didn't include myself, how do we spend our leisure time? Goodness knows how much time I spend playing first person shooters. Um, in some sense, yeah, it is very natural for young males to be fascinated by violence, conflict, first person shooters. Should we be aiming to tweak our genomes so that we no longer have these some of these nastier predispositions? Essentially, history doesn't record a single example, and this point isn't original to me, a single example of women banding together for the purposes of a war of territorial aggression. Whether we're talking about chimps and humans, this is a distinct part of the distinctive male phenotype. And I would imagine that in the long run, too, all kinds of other traits beyond hedonic range and hedonic set tone that hedonic range and hedonic set point that I've been talking about in this discussion will be modified too. But in many cases, this is going to involve an order of magnitude greater complexity.
Okay.
Okay.
You're talking about in your blog also about the idea that first we will care, when we're talking about animal welfare, we will care for wildlife on land and then in oceans. And so you say it will take some time, but at the end of this, near the year 3000, you were writing, there will be the point where the last invertebrate will have a last mild form of suffering, and then paradise engineering is completed. On your blog, you're even talking about more about ideas that goes through the whole universe. So what about aliens? If there are aliens somewhere in our cosmos, can we go there and can we help them to stop suffering? And then you're even talking about the idea of multiverses. Can you maybe, if you want, talk about this point in your thoughts a bit?
Yeah, I mean, a lot to cover there. Yeah, back in 1995, the imperative prophesied that the world's last experience below hedonic zero would probably lie perhaps a few hundred years hence, some form of mild pain in some obscure marine invertebrate. My approximate timescale hasn't changed. This is, needless to say, guess, vast number of different factors to consider. Back in 1995, I couldn't have anticipated the theoretical power of gene drives to sculpt evolution, to manipulate nature, an incredibly powerful technology that can be used for good or ill. Let's assume whatever the time scale, and you mentioned the year 3000. I think this was in some Quora question I was asked to imagine what life would be like in the year 3000. I don't know. I mean, in terms of the world's last experience below hedonic zero, if there were global consensus, it could be done in 100 years. This is unrealistic. In the long run, I mean, I'm inclined to some form of technological determinism. Once we really can choose globally hedonic range, hedonic set points, the level of suffering in nature is an adjustable parameter. Yeah, it's going to happen, is my tentative prediction. Once we have a happy biosphere within our solar system, there is no suffering. There is the question, what about the wider galaxy and the wider cosmos? A couple of possibilities to discuss here. One is the need for cosmic rescue missions. If you don't buy into the rare Earth hypothesis, which I tentatively do, there may be other Darwinian biospheres in the accessible cosmos, and I would say that we have a moral responsibility to rescue Darwinian life forms elsewhere. Realistically, it's probably more likely that humans, if we were to acquire spacefaring technology tomorrow, would go out and spread suffering rather than diminish it. In practice, for a variety of technical reasons, I think we're likely to be alone in our Hubble volume. There's this question of the so-called thermodynamic miracle of the origins of information-bearing self-replicators. I'm skeptical that we are going to encounter any alien civilizations or even any alien biospheres, but we don't know this. And one of the ways I've sketched where we could make a catastrophic mistake is a thought experiment. Imagine if there is some alien civilization elsewhere in the galaxy and they do everything I've been urging, abolishing suffering, creating life based on gradients of bliss, happy biosphere, but this alien civilization made a morally catastrophic mistake. They thought they were alone. If they had realized that other planets, other biospheres supported horrific suffering, they could have developed spacefaring technology and rescued us. I don't regard this scenario as likely, but it's possible. What should we be doing once we have fixed the problem of suffering on Earth? In practice, vacant ecological niches tend to get filled. I don't think that, being a negative utilitarian, that we have an overriding moral obligation to spread bliss and happiness throughout the galaxy or our local supercluster. In practice, it's probably quite likely to happen. I don't know what kind of credence to assign this. A diet of Star Trek and other sci-fi movies makes us think that spacefaring will be interesting. In practice, all we would encounter is lumps of rock and gas giants. And just as most of us don't find particularly appealing the idea of setting up camp in the middle of the Sahara Desert, it's possible that instead of who've going out to colonize the galaxy. Transhumans and posthumans will essentially use immersive VR, exotic designer drugs, and create everything they want without actually leaving our solar system. This is speculative.
Okay.
Good. So, um, wow, yes, that's ideas that I guess that lead in the far future of mankind. So where will stand mankind in 10,000 or 100,000 years? I think then these sci-fi topics will be reality maybe.
Then we travel to different planets and tell them that our God
Yes,
is the real God.
yes. You're also talking about panpsychism in your blog, but I think it would lead too far to talk about this. So there is the idea that everything is sentient. In this case, even, I don't know, even the chair would have a sentience. It's a kind of a animistic thought.
I'm not an animist, I should stress.
Okay. Um, so what is interesting to me, maybe to lead near the end of our talk, how did you come to this topic, and how is your job? So it's I guess it's your main job to promote transhumanist ideas, to promote paradise engineering. How did you get to that? And what is your idea to how can we connect and how can we make a worldwide movement for paradise engineering? I guess you know the name Brian Tomasic. He has
Indeed, yes,
ideas
yes.
that are, I guess, quite near to yours, I would say. He has the blog reducing-suffering.org. Um, how could we, for example, in Germany or in all other countries, promote the idea of paradise engineering? What would you give us on the way?
I'm going to answer your last question first. Possibly the biggest stumbling block in Germany is, for obvious reasons, the sheer weight of history. And I think for a German speaking audience needs to become familiar with the idea of genome reform without thinking back to 20th century history, that it is good to think of all the conceivable ways that things can go wrong, and they most certainly can. All children born today are unique, untested genetic experiments born without an impossible prior consent of, I would say, the victim. If one thinks it's ethically supportable to conduct these genetic experiments, I think we have a moral obligation to load the genetic dice. And so, within a German context, particularly, I would be looking for ways to defang this knee jerk response that one will often get with a German audience. Brian Thomasik, very interesting person. I've never met anyone so incorruptible, extraordinarily high personal integrity. We've got a lot of, in terms of our ideas on reducing suffering, we've got a lot in common, but also significant differences. In that Brian believes in the possibility of digital suffering, digital sentience. One of the conjectures that he's most celebrated for is that video game characters could experience rudimentary forms of suffering. Whereas I argue that classical digital computers, implementations of classical Turing machines, can never be conscious because they cannot solve the phenomenal binding problem. The binding problem is the mystery of why is it if you're a bunch of 86 billion odd membrane bound classical neurons, why aren't you a so called micro experiential zombie? How is phenomenal binding possible? And for technical reasons, as I said, I'm happy to explore, but for technical reasons, I don't think machines with existing computer architecture are going to wake up. The very nature of the abolitionist project, paradise engineering, would be very different if digital computers could support sentient beings. How did I come to these ideas? And complex process, and if one gives a lightning sketch, it gives one's life much more narrative coherence than it probably deserves. You know, I can trace back to the age of 4 and 5. I was a very sensitive child, and you know, in our garden, I could see a worm being extracted by a blackbird, and I was upset at the poor worm, so I clapped, and the blackbird flew off. But of course, I realised that on reflection that, well, if the blackbird didn't eat, she or her nestlings would starve. And at the age of 4 or 5, clearly I couldn't envisage ways to reprogram the global ecosystem. Looking further ahead, yeah, I was a fairly depressive, introspective, troubled teenager. I stumbled across the work of Olds and Milner on the pleasure centers, or warheading, that we touched on earlier. I was entranced by this prospect. No more pain, no more suffering, and was disconcerted that most of my friends, circle of acquaintance, parents did not find the idea of warheading entrancing. Came to realize that any sociologically, politically feasible perspective would involve hedonic recalibration, preserving information sensitivity, thinking through the issue of, yes, different possible drugs, then moving on to genetic engineering, recalibrating the hedonic treadmill. I couldn't see how to solve the problem of suffering in nature, with the exception of large terrestrial vertebrates. I was in the habit of invoking Drexler engines of creation, nanotechnology. But yeah, in essence, I suppose I've got, you know, this this mental blueprint for a world like without suffering fairly early on. But back in 1995, when I wrote the manifesto, the human genome hadn't been decoded. Cultured meat and animal products were still sci-fi. No one was familiar with the idea of gene drives. Essentially, yeah, core ideas fairly early, but it's been a case of working out detail sense. And in one sense, drawing up these blueprints, it's fanciful, because, you know, I can write welfare state for elephants, the gene drives paper. No one is going to dust down these blueprints and implement them. But it's important, and the reason for doing so is, I think it's important for people to recognize what is and isn't technically feasible, so we can open up an ethical debate about what we should do.
Okay.
Okay. So
Thank you.
thank you very much.
Yeah, you're working together with Nick Bostrom. I was reading a book from him some years ago. Nick Bostrom also believes in the idea that digital or artificial intelligence systems can become sentient, I guess.
Yeah, there's a great irony, in a sense, that a negative utilitarian and theoretical button presser, that's me, teamed up with a pioneer of the discipline of existential risks to set up the World Transhumanist Association. But yes, Nick does believe in digital sentience, whereas I would say anyone who thinks that classical digital computers, implementations of classical Turing machines, or classically parallel connectionist systems can wake up and become sentient, has to outline not just their solution to the hard problem of consciousness, but how they think our machines can solve the phenomenal binding problem. Because as it stands, it's not clear why we aren't micro-experiential zombies. Why is it? I mean, consider your enteric nervous system. 500 million odd neurons, the so-called brain in the gut. And yet, to the best of our knowledge, the so-called brain in the gut, is not a subject of experience for the pleasure-pain axis. There's no phenomenal binding. What is it that makes animal minds, animal nervous systems, central nervous systems special so that they support local binding, that is, individual perceptual objects? Neuroscanning detects activation of distributed feature processors, edge detectors, motion detectors, color mediating neurons in the brain. But how is it that you actually right now you're experiencing a unified percept, a particular object? And there's also global binding, the unity of perception and the unity of the self. Anyone with a theory of mind and consciousness has to explain their solution to one, the hard problem of consciousness, two, the phenomenal binding or combination problem, three, the problem of causal functional efficacy. How is it that consciousness has this causal functional ability to allow us to discuss its existence? And also the Palette problem, what explains the extraordinary diversity of conscious experience given the relative homogeneity of the constituents of the CNS. And what might sound like mere philosophical speculation actually has profound moral relevance. I mean, imagine, for example, I could be catastrophically wrong about the impossibility of non-trivial digital sentience. I take very seriously consciousness fundamentalism, the idea that I explore non-materialist physicalism, the idea consciousness could be fundamental in nature, but that's not enough to solve the binding problem. One has to give an account of how it comes together, and this has profound moral relevance. Compare how the Cartesians vivisecting dogs, no conception of anesthesia or anything like that, and they believed that these were mere distress vocalizations, that the dogs weren't suffering. And I argue that video game characters or anything else we create with our existing computer architecture, essentially it's just zombies of no intrinsic moral significance. I could be wrong. I mean, most people talk a great deal of nonsense about consciousness. The principle of mediocrity suggests I could too. So it's important we get our theory of mind, consciousness, and binding right to avoid moral catastrophes.
I think it has to do not only with intellectual questions, but it's a lot of human intuition. So for me, for example, the idea that a video game character is feeling something, it's weird on one hand. On the other side, my intuition is for me it's kind of and disgusting when I see people like torturing their characters in, I don't know, Second Life or something like that. I think, what is this? Although I guess it's not really a being that is feeling something in this video game. There is even guys who say that animals do not fear pain. I don't know how you come on that idea. First of all, of course, there is a lot of scientific proof that, of course, they have a nervous system. Second, it's also our normal human intuition, our compassion that I know that we were talking about rabbits, that the rabbit is feeling something. In your blog, you're also writing about very bad experience of wild animals. We humans think, okay, it's some kind of not so cool feeling when we see the zebra running away from the lion in a documentary, but we do not think about the real horror, how it is to be a zebra running away from a lion. And this is the topic of the moral urgency of your idea of paradise engineering, to make it shortly. Yes, thanks for your time. Marcus, do you have any more topics, questions?
I don't have any more
Dave?
topics. No. I think we tagged everything that I wanted to know, and yeah, I'm just blown away from since the first time I read this yesterday that there are really people that yeah put that look at this field of science and philosophy, that there are people that work on this, and I think it's very interesting. And this is a topic that is transhumanism is a topic that will be discussed more and more and more in the future. And yeah, maybe there are people that don't have a really opinion on it. They will have an opinion, or maybe have to have an opinion in the future. But maybe it's long in the future. But yeah, I don't have any more questions. I'm completely fulfilled.
Yeah, so you have the last word, Dave. So maybe you have a statement for the final. I don't know. So I just say thank you for the time, and it's a very important field on which you're working, and I think you are also bringing to the conscious of many people these ideas, and how important your ideas, and how cool it is that we human beings, as animals who have ratio, can change nature and can help ourselves and all other animals. It's a very high level, cool idea.
I just say, Marcus Jones, thank you for inviting me on your show. Apologies to any listeners who think we've skated over all kinds of issues. Feel free to drop me a line. My original motherlode website is headweb.com, hedweb.com, in which I explore some of these ideas in more depth. But yeah, let's fix the problem of suffering. Everything else, all the glorious stuff, paradise engineering, life based on gradients of superhuman bliss, is going to be the icing on the cake. And yeah, I would urge everyone, all of your viewers, yes, to think what they could be doing to fix the problem of suffering, in not just in humans, but in non-human animals. And I would urge anyone who isn't yet vegan to go vegan, but also thinking how we can avoid bringing more life and involuntary suffering into the world, and yeah, the prospects of genome reform. So yes, onward, infinite bliss. Thank you both.
Thank you very much for your time.
Thank
And
you.
yeah, thank you for everyone out there. If you're interested in this, how we said, look at the site. We will link it under the video. And thank you very much. And thanks for watching. Ladies and gentlemen, stay cool and stay healthy. Thank you very much. Tusen Tag. Bye.
Hello Friends! Wenn euch das Ganze gefallen hat, dann liked und teilt das Ganze doch. Und vor allen Dingen folgt uns, macht das Plus weg, drückt die Glocke und gebt eure ID-Kartendaten zur Altersbestätigung ein. Und verpasst keine weiteren Folgen. Zudem findet ihr über 100 weitere Folgen und Videos auf unterschiedlichsten Plattformen. Jeden Montag gibt es eine neue Folge von uns, plus regelmäßig zusätzlichen Content. Folgen ist und bleibt kostenlos. Zudem liken wir und beantworten wir jeden Kommentar und euch alle Fragen, die euch interessieren. Vielen Dank und stay fresh. Bye.